Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Beelzebub, and today we are building in the Delver Dale area of the Wishing Alps. Since Belle's village is in the nearby area below, this felt like the perfect place for a beautiful castle estate for Beast. To start, I'm adding in these tree and bush clusters from the Wishblossom Ranch DLC to fill in the area next to the entrance. With the plants in place, I start adding in snowy path pieces to create a walkway through the woods, much like what Belle had to ride through in the animated film. I also make sure to map out the paths to the mining nodes in the area, as I like to keep my heavily decorated areas functional for resource gathering. Now that the entrance is suitably covered in foliage, it's time to work on the castle grounds. I am adding the Disney Parks entrance to add onto the castle and make it appear more grand. My inspiration for this part of the build is actually the palace at Versailles. We do not have nearly enough room to recreate the castle grounds entirely, as Versailles is unbelievably massive, but we will do our best with what we have. One fun fact about me, I was lucky enough to be able to see the palace and grounds of Versailles in person for a belated honeymoon trip. And one thing I learned on this trip, the grounds are deceptively big, and if you aren't close to the gates at closing time, the French will just lock you in. We were nearing the closing time of the grounds, and we were deep in Marie Antoinette's faux village hamlet when they announced the grounds were closing. We tried to make it out as quickly as we could, but all the gates were shut and locked when we approached them. We had to jump some fences and walls to escape and ended up teaming up with an Australian couple who had made the same mistake of being too deep in Versailles near closing time. So if you're ever lucky enough to travel to Versailles, here's a hot tip. Leave an hour earlier than closing so you don't get trapped. Alright, enough story time. I decorated the front of the grounds using Beauty and the Beast items, including the topiary and the new rose items from the Once Upon a Dance Dream bundle. Now I am laying down some Main Street pathing around the castle. Here I started pulling out other items I wanted to include, such as the new snow angels from the Star Path and the date night table. I really wanted to include the skating rink because of the ice skating scene. I can't remember if it's from the original animated Beauty and the Beast or the Christmas sequel with Tim Curry. Either way, it deserves a place here. Here I'm adding a little bit of lighting using these oil lamps. Then I start adding in more details to make the place feel as grand as possible. Once the front was in good shape, I added the last path to the mining node tucked behind the castle. I wanted to use the wrought iron fencing around the castle to match the bit of iron on top of the mansard roofs of the Disney Parks entrance. I thought the similar materials added a nice continuity to the design. I am sorry for the foggy weather on the later half of this build. If it helps, I went to Versailles in January, so this is an accurate depiction of how the air sometimes looked around Paris, France in the dead of winter. Here I'm adding in large trees behind the build to fill out the background spaces. To help us see through the fog, I add even more lighting around the grounds. I felt like the front was missing a more interesting shape, so I extend the paving and add more fencing to create a more complicated entryway to the castle. The front also really needed some manicured foliage, so I chose the Glamour Gulch hedges. My last step is to flip it to night to check the lighting levels and sneak an ancient vacuum behind the castle. And with that, we are ready for our tour.
It's nice to see the sunshine.
Thanks again for joining me as we went from this to this. Unlike me and that Australian couple, you are free to go at the end of our lovely tour. I hope you join me next time where we finish the Wishing Alps with an Arundel-inspired build. Ta-ta for now.